Beep boop bop.
Anthony, break it down.
Good morning.
Yay!
From deep in the bowels of the mothership, we have recently uncovered a series of ancient tapes containing conversations on game design which we are declassifying and sharing with the public for the first time. This is the Barash Files. Woo, pretty spooky stuff.
In that case, allow me to welcome you to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, Penguin Poem Understander Maddox.
I always understand your poems about penguins.
So far, 1 for 1.
1 for 1.
I don't think I've written any other poems about penguins, but it's really hard to say. Before we get into poem talk, let's introduce our other guest, because this is another episode of the Barash Files. So we have our returning guest many times over now, Zach, Panama Poem Understander, Barash.
Yeah, going for the record, most guests.
I did not understand the Panama poem.
That's okay.
I did get the Panama poem.
I only remember you getting my penguin poem, which I thought was a really good poem.
Can you recite the poem for us now?
The word was castle.
This is how poems usually start, right?
The word was castle,
you say what the word was.
And my poem was... I didn't say crossing. I used some cantering. I said cantering. Cantering across snow-covered terrain least efficiently was my poem.
Beautiful.
And I just had to think, what was the wibbliest, wobbliest, most clumsy ice creature? It's not a polar bear.
It's Doctor Who.
It could be a seal, but those don't really canter.
I thought
Penguin. Those are the three
I thought
snow
people were
creatures.
I thought everyone was gonna get it, and that was not the case. I think it was less than half of the other people got it. People didn't know what cantering meant, and I was like, oh, I thought people would know that one.
It's often associated with horses as well,
Yeah.
so it's hard to get that out of your mind.
I was like, zebra. That's like a snow horse. But they got the black stripes too.
And I'm not going to remember Mike's absolutely insane Panama poem. Does either of you remember it? It was Avenue, and it was viaduct expanding northward.
It was under north or something.
I just went with
under equator.
It had to be a
Under equator is how it
country.
ended. It was viaduct expanding northward under equator. Was there an A before the...
I don't know. You're doing better at this than I would be.
Yeah. Anyway, I did not get that was Panama. Not even close. Maybe, just maybe, because Panama's in the northern hemisphere.
Well, that's what we're here to talk about today. Poetry.
Squabba-da-bop.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zach Barash. I'm the guest. I think this will be my final time guesting for an arbitrary period of time. Probably going to be a while because having a baby, which I'm very excited about. I work for Wizards of the Coast. This is a relatively new occurrence. I'm excited about it. And as always, these are my opinions that I'm talking about with my friends, not my employers.
These are not the wizard's opinions, and do not ask for them. The wizard will not tell.
Do you want to give us a little bit of context about what these poems are about? I feel like it's a little bit...
No, you just have to meet me and talk about it. We can share the experience together.
If that's where you want to leave it.
Yeah, Zach designed a beautiful game about poetry. If you want to play it sometime, find Zach. That's your only option. We're talking about playtesting on this episode. I think we should get right to the topic because I want this to be one of those episodes that people can refer back to in the back catalog and have it be evergreen, where we talk about this topic and just get right to the point. We've covered this before on the show, for sure. We've talked about what to do about feedback from your players, how to playtest a cube effectively, what you should or shouldn't derive from a playtest. But we are now, for the first time, joined by a professional game designer. So we're going to talk about playtesting again, and also I'm sure, Anthony, your and my opinions have changed in the 2 years since we talked about it first on the show.
Seems likely.
So let's do a little bit of recapping, because we talked about some of the precursor stuff to playtesting probably a couple of months ago in podcast
let's not
time.
even assume people listen to the previous episode. Let's just start at the top.
All right, so like the basic loop of game design, it's what's called the iteration loop, where you basically come up with a hypothesis. Often, is this fun? Is this interesting? Will this work? Will these specific tweaks yield the desired game state that I want? You build a quick and dirty prototype to playtest that. You playtest it. You feed the data back into the hypothesis, and you repeat that process over and over and over again until you're like, I'm done, or I have answered all my questions.
I quit.
or I need to make dinner now because I have invested too much time into this. We're going to focus on that critical step of playtesting today, which is anytime you're playing a cube. I guess there's like already so much that I want to jump into right now. So I say like there are also many different forms of playtesting. Not enough people I feel like do solitaire playtesting or sealed playtesting or 2-player draft playtesting. But regardless, I feel like for cube designers, oftentimes the holy grail is you get 8 people together and you playtest.
And I think the first question I have is, what to you, if any, is the difference between playtesting a cube and playing a cube?
It's a great question. I feel like the only thing that really needs to occur to have a playtest, ideally, is you're doing the intentional work of that iteration process. You are coming in with specific questions that you would like to have answered. You are engaging in that experience in a way that will help you have those questions be answered. And because you have specific goals in mind, you can curate the kinds of feedback you solicit or receive from people to help guide your process. Oftentimes, people will go into a playtest with very nebulous goals of like, I just want people to have a good time, which, by the way, totally acceptable, a viable goal. But oftentimes, if all you're doing is just following the fun, as the most common phrase is, you might end up spinning in circles, or one person.
The fun is in my butt. I have to keep chasing it.
No, but like one person is going
Like
to
a
tell
dog.
you this is what I
like
find.
a dog chasing its tail. No.
Get what you're saying,
Sure,
but
that's how
also
you could read that
our,
sentence.
the listeners can't see that we have a cute dog in the room.
Yeah, they can definitely clip that out of context if you want.
So, I mean, to add a little bit to Andy's question, I feel like playtesting sounds maybe a little bit formal for a lot of people that are designing cubes, where they just want to build the cube and then play with their friends. I think it's worth talking about in formal terms, but do you think it always has to feel formal for players? And maybe is it more just about the emphasis on the designer paying attention while their other players are going about doing what they normally would be doing, playing a cube?
That's a great question. And when I've done like professional tabletop game design, I'm often really formal. I mean, I'm formal about a lot of things. That's just me. But I am formal about that process of I want to do things to signify to my players that I'm respecting their time. Oftentimes because I'm presenting them with a really janky prototype that's put together with twine and duct tape. I think that's a phrase we used previously, and it's just true. A great prototype is something that you throw together quickly to answer a question rather than something you try and make perfect. Cubes don't need to be that. And sometimes it's just good enough to hang out with your friends, play cubes, see what people find fun, and just go based on vibes. There's nothing wrong with that. The people in this room, often a lot of the cubes that we've made, we aren't making very familiar types of cubes. A high power level singleton 360 or 540 based on some existing format of the game. We're asking questions we don't know the answers to, and I think that demands or at least rewards somewhat more of a regimented process. You're going in with specific questions that you're looking to get answered, and there's certain kinds of feedback that will be helpful, certain types of feedback that will be neutral, and certain types of feedback that are unhelpful completely.
So you're saying the further afield you're going from kind of known space where you can rely on prior art, the more valuable it is to do more rigorous structured playtesting, because there's going to be more questions that aren't easily answered by everything else that's already happened.
Or at the least, the more value there is in intentionality of you don't need to go in with like, I'm going to have a notebook, though again, I recommend everybody have a notebook everywhere. Because taking notes on your phone makes people think you're texting. Taking notes on a computer makes people think that you're on social media.
I just have a pencil. I don't have a notebook.
Well, I have a notebook on my person if you'd like one. But like that's a good way to signify to players that you're respecting their time. But Cube is a little bit different because like sort of people already know and trust the game pieces are going to be fun to play with. It doesn't need to be as formalized. The areas in which I think the formal process are really helpful are when you're trying to craft for certain things. If you're not just trying to make the power maxed cube, which is the kind of default feedback that people are going to give you, this card is too strong, this card is too weak, I like this card make me miserable. You don't need to go in that with that much. And oftentimes the end result that you're going to have is a very familiar looking cube that's similar to a lot of other experiences, which I wouldn't be surprised for a majority of cube designers is a great end state. And doesn't demand formal playtesting.
Yeah, I think you're right that the type of feedback players are most likely to give is very surface level and entirely related to the performance of the cards in their deck. This was bad. This was good. I have this in my sideboard and don't ever want to put it in my deck even though it's in the colors I'm playing. That kind of feedback. Do you like to ask deeper questions of players when you are in playtesting mode and trust them to respond in a way that is not purely motivated by the desire to win, but instead from a broader perspective of game design? Or do you consider the only feedback you're going to get from players is basically like player-focused, goal-oriented feedback, and then you always have to digest that and turn it into design-based feedback?
It's a great question. Receiving feedback is a matter of applying different kinds of filters. Sometimes you can prime a player into answering the kinds of questions that are helpful, and there's a hierarchy of questions that go from what your players are experts in to what your players are not experts in to what they are generally going to be completely off base about. The most valuable thing, I believe, and I think like in general what most game designers would say, is emotional feedback is the most valuable thing. This was cool. I felt powerful. I felt hopeless. I felt confused or overwhelmed. Players are masters of their own emotional states. Unless you are, I don't know, Charles Xavier, you are not going to have anywhere close to as good an understanding of how they're feeling just by reading their body language or hearing what they're saying than what they're saying. And if you can get players to give you that kind of direct feedback, oftentimes it will help you directly answer questions or think about things you weren't even considering. Feedback becomes less useful the more layers of thought that are applied on top of that immediate emotional reasoning. So normally players are going to try and help you out by going another step forward. They're not going to tell you, here's how I felt. They're going to say, here's the problem. Here's the thing that made me feel weak. The reason that I felt powerful is because this card was strong. So I'm just going to tell you this card was strong.
I mean, I would say a lot of players even jump right to just proposing a solution to what they think the problem they're identifying is. I would love it if my players just identified problems, but instead I get, you should add this or you should cut this.
And solutions are generally the least helpful kind of feedback. It feels so helpful. It feels so good to tell somebody, here's your problem and I've solved it for you. And it can feel really reassuring where you're like, oh man, I don't know where to go next. What do I do? And a player just tells you what you can do. The problem with that and the reason why you need goals is players are only engaging with what you have presented to them. They're not engaging with the totality, especially in a cube. In a cube, if you have an 8-person draft and it's a 360, they are engaging with 1/8 of the cards. They played with everybody, but they have no idea what your design goals are. They have no idea what you've tried already. I can't tell you how many times I've had a playtest and somebody has suggested something that I've rejected because I tried it out because I thought it was a great idea, and it just didn't work. And sometimes they're right in the sense that a project has changed so much that an old rejected solution can be brought back in and is functional. But more often than not, solutions are the least helpful, often counterproductive type of feedback because they don't know any of the restrictions that I'm going by.
Right. Or they introduce a solution that causes 2 other problems that are not related to the problem they're currently experiencing, and they only have the vision to see, here's my current problem and I want to fix it, not the broader system level perspective.
And framing is really, really helpful. When I'm playtesting a cube, people will ask me for feedback, or even before a cube, before drafting, I'll say, like, hang on, are there any particular kinds of feedback you're looking for? Any kind of questions you want? Priming and framing can be really helpful for making it productive. So I'll say to people, like, the Cascade Cube is something that I put out the first version of in early 2023. It was designed with a specific goal in mind of I was building something inspired by Baltimore's own Turbo Cube and Reading Rainbow Cube. I wanted to make a rules-modified cube intended for a subset of people at CubeCon. I really wanted to do what I could to make that a pleasant, streamlined experience, and I wanted to follow the fun. So a lot of my playtests early on, I was like, look, this is an early prototype. I am really just trying to identify which of these things are working, which of these things are fun. In my head, I had that touchstone I talked about, I think, a few episodes ago of like, in my heart, I have this dream that somebody's going to Snapcaster Mage with 1 mana up, hit the spell that they can flash back, and then flash it back with a Snapcaster Mage. Never happened in the cube, not a helpful touchstone anymore, but early on, it was helpful until I abandoned it for battle runs. Similarly, when somebody asks me for feedback, I'll be like, I don't know, what are you looking for? What have you tried? What are you interested in? How can I be helpful to you? Because otherwise, it'll very easily become, this is how I would redesign your environment to maximize my enjoyment of it. And for probably every designer in the world, that isn't actually a priority they have. And me articulating that will help them understand how to better articulate what they're trying to solve for.
Yeah, there's a bit of a joke in the cube design community that if you ask the average cube designer what they should do to your cube to make it better, they say, well, make it my cube. Simply add the cards I like and take the cards out I don't like. So I think being very articulate about goals, if you're asking for feedback in that way, is important. I think there's a big difference when you're asking for feedback from a random player who has never designed a cube, no interest in cube design, and a player who also is a cube designer, because they're going to give you a very different type of feedback, which is sometimes actually less useful. Like, I don't want you to tell me what you think needs to be changed. I want you to tell me how you felt when you cast this card, or how you felt when your opponent cast this card against you, or whatever.
And that's why playtesting against people who are unfamiliar with the kind of thing you're doing, like game designers will so often just playtest with game designers because they're used to giving each other their time. And game designers have so many heuristics and experiences built up, so they can just tell you solutions to problems that they had before, which again feels like a favor and yet is the thing that game designers by and large know they shouldn't be doing. Somebody who has never experienced the kind of thing you're putting in front of them is more likely to provide you with a novel emotional experience, even if it's, I was completely overwhelmed, and your takeaway is, yeah, you're not really the audience that I'm designing this for. Here's a possible question for you folks. I've designed a couple different cubes that had very different audiences in mind, and I've solicited different forms of feedback for them. I'm curious if this might be interesting or helpful for us to go through, and if you have stories about your cubes that are similar.
As in, what are the kinds of different feedback we ask for from players for each different kind of cube?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can start there. So the two projects I've been working on the most for the past year have been, really year and a half, have been my Neoclassical Cube, which is an old border unsleeved cube that is all about capturing the vibes of the old days of Magic, and my 100 Ornithopters Cube, which is a cube where the only creatures are 100 copies of Ornithopter, and you have to use Ornithopters in some way to win the game. The only feedback I'm really interested in from players, for the most part, from the Neoclassical Cube, the question I ask the most are like, how do the vibes feel on this? Because I actually break my rule of old border in quite a few circumstances just for cards that I think fit the vibes. I'm happy to play a new border card as long as I feel it suits the vibes of old border Magic, could have theoretically been printed in old border Magic, doesn't deviate from the old design patterns that cards often exhibit, which is a very subjective, hard to get your head around thing. So, for example, I, for a little while, ran a Chromos Memorial in that cube, which is only printed in New Border. It's a 7-mana artifact that gives your creatures keyword soup, which is reminiscent of a Chroma, which is a keyword soup, maybe the original keyword soup creature, if I'm honest. And then the Time Spiral Chroma, the red one, which was also a different kind of keyword soup. And I did this to bolster, honestly, I wanted like another Tinker target that was like a build around kind of like fun thing. But it was a card that I was on the fence about. I'm like, is this in the spirit of old school Magic? And I asked so many players that had this in their deck, I had to play it against them, like, did it feel out of place? Did it feel like it didn't belong here? Because, you know, a card like Burst Lightning, I think totally does belong. Is it a little above rate for some old border cards? Sure, but Lightning Bolt's an old border card, right? Like, and Kicker is an old border mechanic, so like Burst Lightning fits perfectly. No questions about the vibes on that one. But a card like a Chromos Memorial, I'm always asking people about the vibes, because the thing I most don't want to lose in that cube is the feeling of playing old school Magic. And if I become too lenient on my inclusion of cards with newer, more modern design patterns, I think that could slowly slip away from me, which I'll reference here the old border foil cube of Jeff Green that I love. That is the direct inspiration for this cube, but that also the restriction for Jeff is just it is printed in the old border, and as such it includes a ton of cards that are retroactively old bordered, many of which are just the best cards in the cube and do exhibit sort of modern play patterns. And when I've played that cube before, I think oftentimes the right pick is kind of like, well, take all the new cards because they're just a better rate than the old cards. And I think Jeff is pursuing a very aesthetic experience, and that's just not my goals. My goals are different. I want to make sure that the texture of play remains very distinctly old school. And so that's the question I ask most often is just, did this feel out of place? And I've asked that about all of the newer cards I've added, especially ones that are like kind of power outliery. Like a Chromos Memorial is a powerful card, and it could completely define a game, which means that I have to be extra vigilant about it not being out of the vibes.
We need to be extra vigilant and flying and first strike
there you go,
and
precisely.
haste and protection from black.
And protection from red, yeah.
I love that question because it fundamentally is just asking somebody about their emotional state.
It's also a question
feel this way.
Everybody feels they can answer. Like,
Yeah.
nobody feels like, I'm not qualified to answer if this felt off or not, which you will often get if you ask other kinds of questions from players. They're like, well, you're the cube designer. I don't know. I'm just a lowly player. But anyone can tell you if something feels off, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one cube, and I asked very specific questions about that. I'm much less interested in people's anecdotes about the power level of cards there. I know it's a really wide power spectrum cube. I intentionally have some really messed up stuff there and some really low power stuff there. I think part of the appeal of old school Magic is kind of cobbling together the last 5 cards in your deck. I don't think you should have a Windmill Slam 23, 24 playables. I think you should be like, well, I've got these cards that are great, and I guess I'm going to slot this in here and try and make it work. Like, I think that kind of jankiness is part and parcel with old school Magic. So I don't really Time Spiral's broken. I'm aware, and you can tell me that all you want. Like, Tinker's broken. Yep, I also know that. Like, these cards are not fair cards. So I care less about that, and I think people also understand, even without me necessarily explicitly telling them, that, like, that's the part of the goal here. Part of the goal is playing with some broken cards, and then, you have to attack your opponent with Genesis eventually to kill them, and it's just a 5-mana 4/4. Like, that's part of what the cube is all about.
And that's a great example of helpful framing, both for yourself to refine the kinds of questions you're going to ask, the kind of feedback you're going to receive, and the way that you can prime your players to give you actionable, helpful feedback rather than tell you, this card was strong. You know it's strong. It's not going to go anywhere because it's part of the vibes of the experience.
Yeah. And then conversely, my 100 Ornithopters cube, this is the cube I would say I have been closest to actually play testing. Like, even the earliest drafts of the Neoclassical Cube felt more like, we're just going to play this cube, and like, I'm going to be paying attention. I'm going to be like watching the table, seeing how people feel, seeing what kind of cards are performing well. But I had already kind of achieved my goal, honestly, by draft 1. It was the vibes of old school Magic, and there was plenty of tuning for me to do to the cube to make it even more about my goals. But it was easy enough to be like, I knew I was kind of copying a lot of other old school environments that were like pre-existing. It was somewhat explored space. I felt like I was kind of just jumping into playing that. 100 Ornithopters is radically different. There was no precedent I could look at to give me any sort of guiding star on what was or was not out of bounds, right? Like, were things that destroyed all Ornithopters for 1 mana too good? I didn't know. Were things that would take Ornithopters out of your hand too good? I didn't know. Were cards that would let you take all the Ornithopters out of your opponent's hand and library too good? I assumed yes and never tested them. But, there's a whole bunch of open questions. How good is the Disenchant in the Ornithopter Cube? I didn't know. I was like, well, I don't really want to spend a whole spell on a 0-mana creature, but also if there's whole decks built around the sort of Voltron style, then I don't want to have just a card I can free roll in my main deck that also is a silver bullet against the sort of Voltron strategies. Tons of open questions. So playing that cube was very much more a play testing from my perspective, in the sense that I was like, a lot of these cards might be wildly unplayable in the sense that it is a trap to put them in your deck, or good players will never do it and they're just wasting space in the cube. A lot of these cards are maybe too good, maybe good in a way that is not fun. There's a couple cards that were in the cube initially that I have since cut that I think were the closest to being too good for the environment of cards that I tested. One of them was the Aetherflux Reservoir, which ultimately, for me, it was very good, but it also felt, this is actually more of a vibes question, it felt too distant from an Ornithopter to still fit in the Ornithopter cube. Like, yes, you were primarily upping your storm count with Ornithopters, but the last Ornithopter you cast to put you over 50 life to then be able to laser beam them, it didn't feel like that Ornithopter was responsible for the kill. It felt like it was too much about the Aetherflux Reservoir. And another card, kind of in a similar space, was Grinding Station, which is just allows you basically to mill 3 for every Ornithopter you play indefinitely. That card just proved to be too good, and then even though it was Ornithopters that were milling you, you were still losing to mill, which didn't feel like losing to Ornithopters. And so I didn't know if these cards were going to be fun, if they were going to create decks that were fun, if they were going to create interesting game decisions, and my questions were much more open-ended in that cube. It was less about, like, how were the vibes? It was more about, like, what happened? Like, I can only play 3 games or 3 matches this draft. What happened in your matches? How did things play out? I would go through their pool and be like, was this good for you? Did you main deck this? Like, all kinds of detailed questions about just what went down, and, like, give me your, like, field report, because I felt like I needed just raw information to then figure out what my questions even were.
And what you're describing there is really akin to the early prototyping experience, early on in designing a new game, where you have all of this vulnerability. There's this chance you might be giving your players an awful experience. You really don't know. But I think there's something really beautiful and exciting about asking a question you yourself don't know the answer to, that you and your players all get to figure it out together. And yeah, that's a really different mentality than that vibes-based focus that you had from Neoclassical. And would you say you feel like the questions you're asking now that 100 Ornithopters has been played a fair amount, it's been at multiple Cube events, are they different now?
Yeah, I feel like I definitely have my head around the environment now. It's like some things I learned, for example, are like, I was initially concerned, and a lot of players initially flagged before anybody got drafted the Cube list, like, these board wipes are kind of crazy. Like, Meltdown, engineered explosives, they're echoing ruin. They're so efficient, like more efficient than any board wipes you've ever seen in any other format of Magic of all time. Are they going to be too much? And I was worried they were initially, and I can honestly say, having played this cube, 24 times now, 20 times now, that I don't think they're actually super strong. I think they're kind of conditionally strong, and I would take like a negate or a duress over most of them in most cases, just given the way that the games play out and the things that actually matter. So I have sort of foundational knowledge about the environment now that allows me to inform some more things. I don't have to ask questions like that anymore. I don't have to ask, geez, was Meltdown broken? Because I kind of know that it can be good, but you have to work around it, and there's a lot of ways to get around a Meltdown.
And that's a great example of how somebody is so likely to give you feedback based on the experience that they had. That's a sample size of 1. Whereas you have a lot of information that's informing everything that led up to that point. And it will ultimately lead to some feedback being much more valuable and actionable for you, and some feedback ultimately not having an impact just because it's a third order thing. They're proposing a problem or a solution. And I don't want to say you know better, but you know the specifics of this environment that you've crafted, and that feedback isn't helping for what you're pursuing.
Yeah. So I would say with 100 Ornithopters now, I ask the same questions I ask about most of my established cubes, which is, I'll say this, my MO for any normal draft, which I will say that I don't actually, for the most part, delineate in my head a playtest draft versus a regular draft. I'm always playing the cubes. I don't want my players to come in with any attitude other than I'm playing this cube to play it and have fun. I don't want them to have a layer of I'm expecting you to give me feedback, or you're trying to figure out some question for me. I'll always get players to give me their entire pool back at the end before they leave. And I mean, transparently, I count all the cards at that point. Not because I don't trust anybody, truly, but because cards just get lost. They end up under a mat. They end up on the floor somewhere. Your opponent, had it under their Oblivion Ring and then put it into their pool. And I just like to make sure that I take all my cards home. But I count all the cards, and also, as I'm looking through and counting the cards very quickly, we'll find any cards that I have open questions about in my head and just ask them, how was this for you? What'd you think of this? Completely open-ended. And see what they say. That's the question I ask about most of my cubes, and the way in which I solicit the most feedback is just, what do you think about this? I recently added this. I'm on the fence about it. How do you feel about it? And I get player-focused feedback 95% of the time. Either it was good or bad, power level-wise, and I will often probe a little bit more for a more sort of emotional response, or a more what actually happened, instead of did you think had you synthesized that already into deciding it was good or bad? But that's most of the feedback I get. And in 100 Ornithopters, there are just more cards I have open questions about than there are in the Bun Magic Cube, for example. So I'll ask that about more cards in the average pool than, the last 4 cards I swapped in the Bun Magic Cube. I've been blabbering, Maddox. How do you tailor these questions depending on the environment that you're playing?
So it's varied a lot between the different cubes I've designed, and over time, because just my approach has changed, how I've been thinking about cube design has changed. And I think it also kind of falls into 2 buckets, which I'm curious about your perspective on. One is the kind of emotional responses that I think are really valuable and important. The other is just sort of getting results, using the players as machines to figure out what did you think was the optimal strategy here. And I think especially in the early iterations of my primary cube, the regular cube, a lot of the feedback fell into that second category, where it's just I kind of expect decks to look a certain way. I expect to see, 2-color decks with a splash, and games, that don't take 3 hours, hopefully. And then there's just some very real data of just games take 3 hours, and people are playing these 5-color soupy decks that are looping weird things. And there's some very clear, actionable things about the type of gameplay that I was interested in. Do those 2 buckets kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised with myself. I realized, we haven't even talked about quantitative feedback. Mm-hmm. Everything we've been talking about has been qualitative, of somebody shares an experience with you or an opinion, whereas quantitative is, we have access to data sets. You go to an event like CubeCon, and it's not a massive sample size, but still, you get 8 deck lists per draft of 6 drafts. That's not nothing. And if every single 3-0 deck is a red deck, that says something about your format that is, in a way, undeniable and is also completely devoid of context the way that you would get from a single person.
Right. Which is still, it's useful. And it's even though it's a very small sample set, you can still start to then form hypotheses to go back into the iteration loop to test those. I think where I am now with the regular cube, it's not something that I am tuning a lot, but it's still something that I'm trying to get some information about, and specifically the kinds of goals that I'm interested in are the kinds of players that are playing it. This isn't necessarily the cube that is big and splashy and everybody's going to want to, be super excited to play it when they travel across the country, although weirdly it sort of is that at CubeCon sometimes, but it really is just kind of the workhorse cube for our weekly cube night, and somebody shows up and they are pretty new to the game, or they've been out of the game for 5 years and this is their first Magic experience. I want it to be approachable to them, but I also want it to be replayable enough that it's interesting to the people that are coming back week after week or are really experienced and have played on the Play Tour. So I'm interested in thinking about the way that it is approached by these two groups of people. And for the newer players, I want to know, how did you feel during the draft? Was it overwhelming? Did you feel like you were able to find a direction? There was something to latch onto that carried you through figuring out what your plan was? And then for the experienced drafters, I'm interested in, was there some nuance here? Was there some challenge in being able to recombine different under-supported themes, which is a big part of the way that I've designed this cube. So trying to balance making it accommodating for multiple players as the, staple fallback for the weekly cube night is really where my design interest is.
Unsurprisingly, you're pretty experienced in this, and you came up with a lot of great things there. You identified that there are different kinds of audiences that you need to keep in mind when you're designing an environment, and you need different kinds of feedback in order to satisfy both of them. And you're trying to keep, as I've been saying a lot, you're trying to keep those audiences in dialogue with each other. That both somebody who's very enfranchised and very competitive and somebody who's neither of those things can both sit down, draft this cube together, and have a good time. And you're also doing designing for a specific audience. Now, granted, it's it's a well-designed enough environment that, designing well for one specific audience will often yield a great experience for many audiences, as CubeCon is indicative of. But that's something I would also encourage more designers to do. Think about who's going to play this experience and how you can optimize for them, because there's a very good chance that the specificity of optimizing for one group of people will actually just make the project more coherent for a broader group of people.
Absolutely. And then going on to the second cube that I ever designed, my mono black cube, which was fairly short-lived. This was a very different project because I did just have one really, really concrete hypothesis, or just a question, which was, can Magic be fun without the color pie? And by fun, what I really, to be more specific, I wanted to see, could we still have diverse archetypes and themes and strategies by removing the color pie by only including one color, such that the draft would still be fun and engaging and replayable, and you're not just taking the best card out of every pack and just playing mid-range soup. And again, I was leveraging a lot of just, what did the decks look like? Did they actually look distinct enough? Were there, thematic cards, synergistic cards that ended up being role players? And then using player feedback to identify, how did that feel? Were you excited about building around an individual card? Were you frustrated by an individual card? Yes. Daniel refused to ever play the game again unless I could mimic that.
He communicated very clearly about his needs in that moment.
Very clearly, which we appreciate. And, I think that I got my answer fairly quickly after a couple drafts of that yes, there was enough of it there that I could disprove the null hypothesis that it was impossible to design a fun cube without color, but I also felt pretty clearly that this wasn't funner enough than, actually just leveraging everything that's great about the color pie to make it worth, for me at that moment, to pursue further.
And that's a great example. Again, I know I'm just saying that over and over again, but I'm just really enjoying hearing you folks say that, of sometimes a project is done. Sometimes you get what you need out of your project, and it's an opportunity to move on to the next thing. There's another great phrase in game design of kill your darlings, of just something might work really well in your project, or something might be a pet card and that you love it, but it ultimately ends up not working within that project. But when you can always make something else, you can always make that promise to yourself of, sure, it doesn't fit in this thing, but I don't need any one of my projects, any one of my cubes, any one of my whatevers to contain the totality of all that I am and all that I find joy in. Even if you're making the cube that's just for you, it can't fit everything in, just like one meal cannot fit every single possible food combination that you love inside of it. Or if you do, it's going to be a weird mushy soup.
That sounds like a challenge.
Oh, now I want to talk to you. Like, all right, I don't know. Name your 15 different favorite flavor profile / textural components / just taste.
I mean, for Anthony, I think 12 of those 15 are going to be in ramen. So ramen's pretty close.
It's got a lot. It's got a lot going for it.
If you could made this too easy.
If you could throw a Rushdie inside of some ramen, you might have nailed it.
No, you're right. You're right. It's like sometimes I want the German comfort food, and sometimes I want the Japanese comfort food. And trying to combine them is maybe not the best idea.
What kind of feedback do you solicit for the Turbo Cube?
So the Turbo Cube is interesting because I didn't go into it with focused playtesting with specific questions other than, is this anything? It sort of started as a joke in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think you kind of went in with a small chip on your shoulder of trying to prove that actually playing a bunch of super powerful cards is not fun. And then famously, you discovered, wait a minute, everyone loves this.
There's a reason a lot of people love Powered Cube.
Because they haven't played hyper-powered Cube yet.
No, but I think
it's fun to take game actions.
Yeah. It's fun to do something that's really crazy, really out there. There's a fantasy about the really famous meal or the really, really nice car. And I think a lot of this is the same. If you just get to play with some of the most iconic cards in Magic. And the Turbo Cube says, wait. What if it's not the most iconic cards? But what if it feels like that? It smells like that. It tastes like that. But it's something that's ours in and of ourselves. It's an experience that no one is going to have outside of this one environment where it's like, no. Guild Globe is better than Black Lotus. Don't even fight me. I'm just
so much better. So much better.
And that's beautiful. And I think it's a very connected kind of fun that still is doing it in a way that is highly creative, highly unique, highly aspirational, and highly inspiring to other designers.
Yeah, I mean, and since sort of its second coming of or the second phase of now this is something I actually want to invest a little bit more time into and design in a slightly more serious way that we've kind of proven that it can be fun. The question sort of became more about what are the problem areas? Is this too uninteractive? Does the dice roll matter too much? Are there ways to inject more interactivity on the first turn? And are there ways to just frame it and set expectations such that players know what they're getting into so that they are not frustrated when things, the game ends before they get to take an action. So I think a lot of the ways that the cube has improved is just in the way I introduce it to people, which I think has been a valuable lesson in itself.
Yeah.
That you always say, win the dice roll.
Win the dice roll, absolutely. And people are like, okay, that's important, I guess so.
Gonna put all my skill into that. And yeah, Turbo Cube playing it for the first time was very different than what I thought it was going to be. And I made the Cascade Cube to try and design for the kind of experience that I was looking for from Turbo Cube. Not that I was disappointed, just, wow, that first turn is so critical.
This is actually accounting the gathering.
It's those are really long turns, and it can be kind of uninteractive and solitary. And that's what some forms of Power Cube are for people, or certain types of matchups are. That wasn't what I was pursuing, but also that's not feedback that's going to be helpful for you necessarily, because that's what the experience as it exists in so many ways is. And if you decide to expand it to a 540 and slow it down a little bit, maybe it becomes more of that. Maybe interaction ends up mattering a little bit more. Maybe it's less about winning the die roll and more about sequencing between turns rather than within one turn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that having that realization that this is an easy way to be able to sort of power down the environment without actually removing those cards, which are the fun thing about the cube. I still want Guild Globe to be there and all the eggs to be there, because that is so much the part of that expectation setting, but to make them just a less frequent occurrence by increasing the size of the cube so you're not drafting as much of it has gotten me a little bit more excited about the project again. Whereas I was sort of at the moment where it's like, this is maybe just getting out of hand.
I'm also so excited that you tried out the Odyssey block lands.
Mm-hmm. That was your fault.
Suggestion, fault.
I just, given the power level of everything else in that environment and the fact that you're in almost all decks restricted to a single land turn per play, and there's so many ways to explode with mana, I just didn't believe that it was going to be that powerful relative to so many other options. And also, so much of the cube is about having the right amounts of colored mana, and those lands don't do that for you.
Yeah, unless you get exactly
Unless they
the
really
right
do.
one.
Yeah, but then good, you're getting rewarded
Yeah.
as opposed to it's Guild Globe or Sky Cloud Egg, and you're just always going to take those 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So, my cubes. To talk about these is to talk about audiences, because based on different audience, I'm looking for different kinds of feedback from them. There's my original cube, which I made in 2013, and it doesn't have a name. And I think I played it once in the last 6 years. And I went to break it apart a couple months ago, and I was like, I still kind of love these cards. Maybe I will do something with this. That's a cube that I designed for an audience of playing with my mostly spiky team drafting friends. And in particular, I wanted to craft a scrappier environment because everybody else had a legacy or vintage cube. That's what everybody was playing, and I wanted to do something a little bit different. And there it was really simple, follow the fun type stuff. Also, it was 2013. I had not started doing game design professionally. I was not part of any designer of cube designers beyond the let's make some really strong cards, which is fun, but also is so much more. We have so much more now than we did back then. But that was an instance where I'm only optimizing for the fun of these players. Then there's the UMA Plus Cube, or Ultimate Masters Inspired Cube, which I made for the first CubeCon, which that's a project that I made for me. I loved Ultimate Masters, and I'd been toying for years about making a cube that's just a love letter to it. I playtested that once before CubeCon. I got some pretty strong feedback. I ignored all of it because that environment was for me. No amount of feedback or iteration was going to adjust how much it was or was not for me. And I knew that. And you could say, that's really selfish, man. And I'm like, I know who the audience for this is. Whereas Cascade Cube, I talked about a little bit, and we talked about in previous episodes, that I had giant questions about. That was like 100 Ornithopters for me, or Turbo Cube, where I'm just like, I am way out of my depth here. I'm playing in a space that I don't understand, and I'm going to need people to tell me what's confusing. What worked the way that they hoped it worked and it made them happy? What worked the way that they didn't expect and it made them unhappy? And those two pieces of feedback I kept asking because I made a rules reminder card to make it easier for people to navigate gameplay in the draft of this is how every mechanic in Cascade Cube works with Cascade. That's why I asked that question of everybody, not just to streamline the experience, but for a very specific goal in mind. And similarly, I got a lot of questions or feedback of this card is too strong, this card is too weak. I fought against my players for months about whether Crashing Footfalls was too good or not too good for
I was
going to
bring this up too if you hadn't brought it up. So let's talk about that.
My emotion was sad. It hurt.
Yeah, but you love rhinos.
When my opponent had turn 1 Crashing Footfalls every single game, that was not fun.
Yeah, this is worth talking about because I changed how I felt about that over time. When I made the Cascade Cube, I said the original touchstone was Snapcaster Mage. That didn't pan out. And it ended up being instead
It sucks against 2 rhinos.
Well,
it kind of gains you for life.
It ended up becoming more about these are the kinds of cards that get people, like in Turbo Cube. Guild Globe gets people so pumped in that environment. Just some random common for more of the spark gets people really, really, really excited. It gives them the same kind of good vibes that a Black Lotus does. And I love that. And I love that Mox Tantalite gets to have that same kind of experience. Or the Alara Reborn Border Posts. It's not as interesting to me that the Modern Horizons 2 Pitch Elementals or Snuff Out or Unmask also get that. But just Profane Tutor is the kind of card that's a weird inclusion in a lot of environments. And it's perhaps too good in Cascade Cube.
I can tell you about my feelings about that card because it was in my deck, and so I thought it was great.
It's totally balanced. And I put Crashing Footfalls in because, it just felt right. Inevitable Betrayal, which is bribery but with suspend, felt wrong. Of just I know what the play experience of bribery is going to be. What if it's always on turn 1? Well, the counterplay is take all the fun cards out of your deck, or the fun creatures. But I put Crashing Footfalls in, and I was like, I don't think this is too good.
I think we should explain this because I'm not sure everybody listening is going to have followed all of and connected all of the dots. So in the Cascade Cube, you start with an emblem of what's
the card Maelstrom Nexus, which says the first card you cast each turn has Cascade.
Yeah. And Cascade, as you probably know if you're listening, exile cards from the top of your library to exile a card with lesser mana value. You may cast that card.
Shuffle all the other cards at the bottom, including if you don't want to cast that card.
Now, some of the cards Zach has mentioned, like Mox, Tantalite, and Crashing Footfalls, are cards with Suspend and no mana cost. So the mana value is 0, which means that if you cast a 1 mana spell on turn 1, and you only have, let's say, 1 0 mana spell in your deck, say Crashing Footfalls, it turns every 1 mana spell in your entire deck into also a copy of Crashing Footfalls on turn 1.
Which makes 2 4/4 Rhinos.
And Crashing Footfalls, 2 4/4 Rhinos with Trample. So quite a strong card.
Oh, so Snapcaster Mage only gains you 1 life.
Well, true, you're wrong about that. Now, I think maybe some of the things we can unpack here is like, there's a cost to that. It means that all of your future 1 mana Cascade spells are going to whiff. You don't have multiple 0 mana spells in your deck, so you're giving up all that future Cascade equity. But I'm curious to talk more about the texture of this, because I remember I gave you the feedback. I saw other people give you the feedback that this felt unbeatable, and I remember seeing you in your face and being like, it's just not. Like,
no, you're wrong. There's so many ways to beat that.
I could tell. I could tell that you knew that it was not the unbeatable sort of problem that maybe it felt like it was to some other players. And I'm curious how you process that, because I think there are times when I feel that way, and I think these players just need to learn more about this meta. They need to get better. This is their first time drafting it. They're still getting their feet under them. And there are times where I think I am right in the sense that this is better, but their experience matters more to me than, this sort of deeper meta level being right. So what was your journey with the feedback on Crashing Footfalls?
Great question. Ultimately, I wasn't receiving the kind of feedback that was helpful for me. I was looking at it quantitatively. I said the exact opposite, wrong word, of it just wasn't winning drafts. It kept going 1-2 or 2-1. So I was like, I don't think this card is broken. But as I watched over time, I realized the reason this is happening is people are overcommitting and building their entire decks around this card. And then you just answer one Rhino and trade with the other one, and their deck fails to function. The card is actually leading to people building less functional, weaker, worse decks. And
while at the same time creating a pretty lopsided play experience.
Yep. Like a Crashing Footfalls on 1 is really hard to answer, and if it's answered, the person with Crashing Footfalls loses. It leads to this net negative fun game where one person just isn't doing anything, and it took time for me to see that emerge. Then there was a draft, I think the last draft I played with, where it was in the Cube. Somebody who had never played it before opened it, passed it to me, and I just slid them back the pack. Because in that moment I was like, I know what this card's like. I don't want to play with this. I want every draft I have for this to go to the person who has no idea what they're doing, and they can just have this card to give them simple joy in an overwhelming world. But the majority of the time, the least experienced person of the player is not going to open it. Only 1 in 8 times, and they're
when
the
they
most
do
likely
open it,
to
they're going
pass
to pass it. Yeah.
So it was just that combination of I know this card isn't winning, but the games that it is eliciting aren't themselves fun. And then there was that experience of I don't want to play with this card. And then the final thing was, for a very long time, that card ended up being a dominant player in Modern. It's not like it needed a cube in which to have a place to shine.
That's a great point, yeah.
And granted, something that I'm struggling with right now with Cascade Cube is there are only so many high power level suspend cards that exist. And of those, Crashing Footfalls is out of the cube. Inevitable Betrayal has never gone into the cube. Hypergenesis does not make sense because it just leads to people stopping cascading. They just dump their whole hands. Wheel of Fate doesn't make sense. I'm naming a whole bunch of cards, but it's basically...
Yeah, don't worry about it. It's fine. They'll be on the cards mentioned page, which is linked in the show notes.
A lot of these cheap suspend spells don't work, but as that number falls, as we just have, I think it's just Mox Tantalite, which is a Rainbow Mox, Soul Talisman, which is Soul Ring, Profane Tutor, which is Demonic Tutor, Ancestral Vision, which is Ancestral Recall, and technically there's Glimpse of Tomorrow, which is a very different card because it's not meant to be cast on turn 1. Suddenly it goes from there's all these different powerful cards and everybody gets to play with something cool to only a rarefied small number of people at a table get to open these. At the last
God
draft,
forbid somebody opens 2 or 3 of them.
at the last draft we did, somebody opened 2 and got past a third one.
Uh-oh.
And it just was like they're playing vintage Cube and we're playing modern Cube.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we'll do our best, but we're no longer in dialogue with each other. And there's a version of the Cascade Cube where I just cut all of these effects and I let it be more focused on cards like Force of Will, of ways to cheat up the mana curve and really have minimal control over what you get. That's a very different expression of the idea that I'm not ready for now, but maybe by the time we're prepping for CubeCon, that'll be something that I'm actively considering.
I think that is, to me at least, currently, half of what the Cascade Cube is. I feel like the two things that can happen in that cube are you can have a really cheap 0 mana total bomb in your deck, and then that kind of defines a lot of the texture of the games and matches. Or you can have a bunch of these pitch spells, and you are rolling the dice more, but you're also just getting a ton of value out of each of these Cascade triggers. They're unknown, but their value is high on average. So I don't think that aspect is not present, but I would share your hesitation around cutting the things like Mox Tantalite and Profane Tutor, which it'd be like cutting the eggs from the Turbo Cube. It's
or cutting Tinker and Time Spiral from Neoclassical.
Yeah, sure. Is it more balanced now? Yeah. Is it more fun? Probably not.
No. Yeah.
Probably not.
And that's the thing. Sometimes we have these questions where we're like, I don't know how to answer this. And sometimes you can only answer it by testing. Sometimes you can only answer it by vibes. Sometimes you can only answer it by having all of your friends that you respect insisting the same thing for months on end until you finally listen to them and cut Crashing Footfalls.
I think we probably each have cards like this from all of our cubes. And I want to touch briefly on the idea of the quantitative feedback, because I really never take the win percentages or records of decks into consideration, because I've had plenty of drafts where I think I drafted a kind of mid deck and it just got a little lucky, or my opponents got mana screwed or whatever. I've had plenty of drafts where I think my deck was awesome and I still went 1-2 because I got unlucky in one match and then it got paired into a deck that was just really well favored against mine in another match, right? There's so much variance in Magic. I care so much more about whether my players felt like the games and matches were close. And you can go 2-1, but you tell me that your loss was a total, utter blowout and you had absolutely no hope. You could play 100 matches back-to-back. You're never winning any of them. And I'm going to try and address that problem and make your deck better or their deck worse. Or you can go 0-3 and tell me that all your games were close and you felt like you were 1 or 2 cards or decisions away from them going the other way. And I feel great about that. Perfect. That means that you're in a good spot. I think my current Crashing Footfalls in 100 Ornithopters is Aura Shards.
Oh, let's talk about Aura Shards.
Let's talk about Aura Shards.
Because we talked about this from when I drafted the cube for the very first time.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Aura Shards is an enchantment, 1 white-green, 3 mana total. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, not cast, enters the battlefield under your control, you may destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment. Now, in the 100 Ornithopter cube, there's 2 things that make this way better than normal. One is pretty obvious. Ornithopters cost 0 mana, so if you have an Aura Shards in play, you can trigger it as many times as you have Ornithopters in hand for no additional mana, which means that you can go from having no Aura Shards to blowing up 4 or 5 of your opponent's things in 1 turn cycle before they have any chance to do anything about it. The thing that makes this actually even better, though, which might not be obvious to anyone listening who hasn't played this cube, is that most of the cards that matter in this cube are artifacts and enchantments, because if you can get rid of all the ways your opponents have to buff their Ornithopters, be they various Anthem effects or equipment or whatever, you can leave them with all the Ornithopters. It's fine. You can have all the O2s you want. You can't do anything about it. And because there's very few Planeswalkers in that cube, because Planeswalkers tend to win the game without Ornithopter, it turns out, because there's very few Planeswalkers in that cube, really, Aura Shards destroys every kind of permanent type that matters on the board at any given time. Now, quantitatively, Aura Shards has not 3-0'd that much. Very, very little. I would say maybe 3 of the... Yours is one of them. Maybe 3 of the 20 drafts that have been done have included Aura Shards in the final deck. But I still get a lot of complaints. I think I'm getting a similar sort of barrage of people complaining about it the way that I think people probably complained about Crashing Footfalls in the Cascade Cube.
I think it's probably not as extreme because another thing with the Crashing Footfalls
is it was
is
every game.
Every single game, which
yeah.
just makes it a much, much louder experience.
But here's a difference in experience that I think is going to make Aura Shards bigger of an offender. Crashing Footfalls, when it works, you're going to feel hopeless, but the game ends.
True.
When Aura Shards comes down, the game just goes on, and everything that you do will get answered. and it feels hopeless and miserable. The reason I gave such strong feedback the first time that I played
is you made a bunch of people miserable.
What specifically the finals, our buddy Scott was playing me in the finals. He was so excited about his deck. He had this sweet deck with Thrumming Stone and I think Door of Destinies.
Yep.
And just like in one turn, he was going to be able to make a whole bunch of like 11, 13 Ornithopters or something like that. And I just played both games, turn 3 Aura Shards. There was nothing that he could do. And the light drained from his eyes and the hope drained from his heart. And then he just conceded because what was the point of doing that and going through all that pain? That's why, like, I don't know. Some types of cards are misery-inducing because they just invalidate the game, but at least the game ends. I think it's more dangerous when they invalidate the game, but you keep playing because there's a tiny sliver of hope, but really you've lost already. That's why I advocated so much for getting rid of it the first time. And having played 100 Ornithopters again, I think that experience is completely true, and I think it's a dangerous card. I don't think it's anywhere near as broken as when I first played it, because specifically if you've played it at least once, you know how valuable A, disenchants are, B, counter magic and duresses are, and C, most decks don't want to deploy their cards that quickly. There's a lot of draw go. Games take many, many turns, but most of those turns are really, really fast. And so even if the game goes on for 5 more turns after Aura Shards, oftentimes those are fast cards. And as long as you know what you're doing, there's a good chance you can answer it or keep it from having hit the battlefield in the first place.
Yeah, there's a lot of little like details of the Aura Shards question to unpack. I have personally observed a lot of my own theories as to why Aura Shards might not be totally broken just play out, right? Like I've observed, in my head I'm like, this can destroy an artifact enchantment, but it's only a sorcery speed, and there are so many combo decks here. And I watched twice in the finals the Aura Shards deck that did make it to the finals, which again, I say I don't take quantitative data seriously, and I don't really. So the fact that it's making it to the finals multiple times,
supports your theory,
unless it supports my theory. But I watched these two combo decks both just go from having no meaningful board presence, nothing you can destroy with Aura Shards, to you're dead now, and you had no window to Aura Shards me whatsoever. I'm not worried about that card at all. I hope you don't side it out because it's awful against me. So that's one way you can get around it. You mentioned all the disenchants. Like, it is itself a disenchant. There are also so many more in this environment, and they all can answer Aura Shards. Duress, Counterspell, all that kind of stuff. The bigger one, though, which I think doesn't happen that often, is I played a game against you, Anthony. We've referenced in prior episodes with Zach. Who knows how long ago they came out, where I managed to like do the thing with Aura Shards. I had Aura Shards. I played 4 Ornithopters, blew up your whole board, picked them all with Paradoxical Outcome, did it again. And you didn't concede. I think a lot of people in that situation are like, I lost. Like, I can't possibly beat this.
That is how I felt.
You didn't concede, and you eventually won the game. I think a lot of people feel powerless in the face of Aura Shards, when in reality, if they could see what their opponent's hand was, they've got 1 Ornithopter in hand. And they're like, well,
I knew you had 4 Ornithopters in hand.
Okay, look, my point is just that I think sometimes people don't want to play against it when actually they could totally win, more so than they think they can. Like, I have also seen people play it out and be like, I've only got 1 Ornithopter in hand, and the rest of my cards are lands, so I'm really hoping that I get good value out of this 1 Ornithopter, because now I've basically turned what was a card into like a 2-for-1 myself disenchant, right? Like, it was worse than disenchant in this spot. All of it is to say, I think it's a good card. I think it has the opportunity to be miserable, and I am still on the fence about it. I am keeping it in for now because I have yet to be proven or yet to convince myself that it's actually a problem.
So here's a lesson that I'll take from Cascade Cube that might be applicable to you. We've talked a lot about what goals do we have for our environment and how does that inform our playtesting. Sometimes, as with Crashing Footfalls and Aura Shards, we end up where we're getting a very strong piece of feedback that we have strong reactions to and perhaps hesitation about. But we need to check, does this actually intersect with the goal that I have? Mm-hmm. Aura Shards, I would say, and I'm curious if you agree or disagree, Aura Shards I feel like is deeply intertwined with the thesis of 100 Ornithopters of it's a card that really only makes sense in that cube. It doesn't make sense in a lot of other environments. It is a card that uses Ornithopters very effectively as a fuel piece. But I don't know if I would go so far as to say is that it is an integral part of that experience. And when there's a situation where if it's not directly connected with my goal, and I'm getting a lot of feedback, but I feel hesitation, that might be the best opportunity to outsource some of that decision-making processes, to talk to the people that you respect and say, hey, I'm having this really strong reaction. It's not like somebody saying Tinker doesn't belong in the Neoclassical Cube. Definitionally, Tinker belongs in the Neoclassical Cube, and you can't cut it because it's
You might not
core.
like the Neoclassical Cube, but that's fine. But Tinker belongs there. Yeah.
But like, if you're not sure if it's really one of your goals or if it's not, that's a great opportunity to say, like, you know what? In the case of Cascade Cube, I think it's good for me that I went on that journey. I think more people would have had fun when I was testing out the Cascade Cube if I listened to you, if I listened to Dan Schneider, and I just cut the darn card back in like February rather than cutting it in May of that year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think where I'm at currently is the reason I'm still on it for now is largely what you said, right? I have compared this in the past to, there's an episode of the Uber Cube podcast where Anthony talks about, not our Anthony Uberbear talks about Collector Oof in the Artifact Cube and why that was a problem because it just kind of invalidated a whole bunch of what the cube is about. I just explained that Aura Shards can invalidate a lot of what this cube is about in that it can blow up all the types of permanents that matter and very efficiently. The difference here for me is that you need to be doing the shtick of the cube in order to turn Aura Shards on. Where with Collector Oof, that doesn't actually require that you do anything with artifacts. It's kind of rewarding you for intentionally ignoring the theme. So, for example, I think your Aura Shards deck was one of the best we've seen in that you could very consistently Aura Shards into Glimpse of Nature, into I can destroy any number of things at any time. And that's largely a testament to your deck building and your draft. Like, it went really well and you had all the pieces to make it work. I see a lot of decks that it just doesn't work in, or it's a deck that wants to play at the Ornithopters early and they top deck their Aura Shards and they're like, well, if I had an opening hand, it would have sequenced differently, but I had this military intelligence or I had these equipments I wanted to start getting online and start stacking up +1/+1 counters. So because it still aligns with the theme somewhat, that's one of the reasons I'm still trying it. The other bigger reason, though, is that there's still a lot of changes happening to this cube. Mm-hmm. And the cube that it was in when people were complaining about it 6 months ago, it's not the same cube anymore. And I want to see if as I sort of hone in on what the cube is more and I'm able to sort of get rid of some of the air and the cards that maybe didn't make sense and were never really going to do anything, and instead replace those with other cards that matter and impact the game in meaningful ways, if it still feels like as much of an offender to people. And if it still does, it's probably going to get the axe someday. But
there's a funny little fact about playtesting for Cube within a small playgroup that is distinct from playtesting a professional game that I'm realizing as you're saying that you're not saying, oh, I'm going to take this to my group of playtesters, we're going to test it, we're going to iron out the issues, and then we're going to publish the game and it's going to go out as a refined game to new players. You're likely playing and playtesting, the early iterations and the more refined iteration with the same people. So people might give some feedback and say, this card is a problem. And then you might go fix that problem by changing other cards in the environment. But they might still have that
why didn't you change
idea.
that one thing?
Why didn't you fix this thing I suggested? And you might be like, well, I did fix it, just not in that way, which I don't know if that's like worth thinking about differently or just worth being aware of maybe as you communicate and frame the experience for players.
You're also hitting on a problem, a thing to consider in professional game design of if you keep playing with the same people, which is often going to be the case, especially I had the benefit of a professional playtest team, they just get better. And then they stop catching or they are less effective at catching issues because they get good.
They're not going to fall into the traps that a new player might be very vulnerable to, and you need to be aware of.
And there's the eternal question of, like, what is the cube? Is it the cube to new players? Are is that the experience you care about that you want to balance, or is it the cube for experienced players? And the answer is probably both, neither. Like, the idea of balance is so nebulous anyway that it's so hard to know who you're even trying to balance for, because it would be totally different versus a bunch of experienced players compared to a bunch of players playing the cube for the first time.
And I'll point to my cubes and I'll say, like, my primary, even though it's the least played of my cubes at this point, that's, I think, somewhat approachable because it's a pretty familiar experience to a lot of people with just a couple wacky cards. The Cascade Cube, I think, is the most inaccessible, but it has a great elevator pitch. It's just sort of an execution nightmare. It has really involved turns. The UMA Cube might be the most hostile design of them all because I just made it because it makes me happy, but...
And my happiness is hostile.
No, but like I really wasn't thinking about other audiences because I knew who the audience was. But the as played experience, I think, might actually be the most streamlined, both because it's closest to a retail limited format and the elevator pitch is really clear and concise. Here are 4 pillars of the cube. You can commit to as many of them as you like. 1 or 2 is the best thing that you should do. And if you think I'm wrong, prove me wrong, and it would make me so happy. That's it.
Yeah. And it's funny, like the corollary to Aura Shards in the 100 Ornithopters Cube, which is a card that I still hear a decent number of complaints about, but I have a secret hypothesis that if I tune things just right, it could actually be perhaps a balanced part of the meta. The corollary to that is Echoing Boon, which I think is absolutely broken, and I never hear complaints about. I mean, with rare exception. I hear you, Ollie. Ollie complained about it once at a CubeCon this year. For the most part, people do not complain about that card because I don't think the vast majority of drafters are playing it even remotely effectively. And it's like, okay, so it's fine, I guess. If everyone's going to keep playing it not effectively, then I guess this massive power outlier that I think is substantially better than Aura Shards is fine because most people aren't taking advantage of it. But I don't know, like that one is one that I'm like, it's a bigger problem in a lot of ways, but also it's like me consciously choosing where I want the power outliers to be, and it makes whole decks viable that otherwise I think are hard to make work. But to your point, I actually think it's maybe at its best when your whole deck is already functional and you just get it as a little bit of gravy for a couple of cards in your sideboard, yeah.
Which is how I designed it. Like, I think you and I are in agreement that I love this. You and I are in agreement that Echoing Boon is one of the strongest cards in the cube.
It's messed up.
I don't believe it's the strongest card in the cube. I believe that card is Glimpse of Nature.
Yeah, sure.
But when you've talked about Echoing Boon, you've talked about it as a way to like take this combat trick aggro deck and just mess people up really quickly. And
that is when I get complaints about it. I don't get complaints about it when someone's like, oh, they doubled their Twisted Image.
Yeah, whereas like that's exactly what I was using it for, and I think that's the most messed up way to use it.
But no one complained about that at Cube for a Cause. But the complaints I do get are when somebody gets, turn 2 Berserked, and they're like, well, this card is clearly unbeatable. And I'm like, unless you've removed the Ornithopter.
And that's a great example of different types of feedback, though. One of them is the really powerful emotional experience that's undeniable because people's emotional experience is inherently accurate of I felt hopeless or I felt miserable, even if it's not broken. And then there is these, like, I don't know, higher order thought thing where it's the less helpful feedback of I have identified what I believe is a problem. I've gone beyond the emotional experience, although I'll frame it in a way that is emotional and say, this felt too strong to me.
I felt bad when I was ruining my opponent's days with this card.
I mean, I've given that piece of feedback to people too.
Anyway, it's so interesting to try and turn player feedback into informed cube design decisions.
I've got one final thought on playtesting.
Yeah, go for it.
And it's about ego. This is something that I've seen a lot in newer game designers. You ever seen somebody sort of get feedback and then start debating with the person about whether the feedback is right or not?
Regularly.
And
all throughout art school.
And how often would you describe that as a comfortable experience that was mutually respectful?
No, never. Mm-mm.
So, in general, I would discourage people from debating when you receive feedback, because by and large, it's just going to make everybody feel worse. You might be right. And again, we've talked in this conversation multiple times of this person was giving me feedback that was useless to me. I knew that they were wrong or they didn't know what the goals were, but fighting with somebody is never going to make it helpful.
It's also never going to encourage them to give you more feedback in the future.
It's just going to hurt them or make you angry. And oftentimes I see this coming about because someone's goal, they haven't articulated to themselves, but their goal is not, I want to make a fun time, or I want to ask a question I don't know the answer to, or I want to improve this product. It's, I want to feel validated, which everyone wants to be validated. Everybody wants that feeling. But I think we end up seeking it in areas that can be counterproductive. It's part of the reason why, I don't know, you may have noticed this about me. I try and say nice things about people. I try and say only things that I believe that are true nice things about people, but I don't have to withhold that validation, especially when I'm giving feedback, and oftentimes I'm going to be more direct.
The dog has unplugged your laptop, thus signaling the beginning of the end of the podcast.
So I would just encourage people, if somebody... this actually is going to be probably the appropriate segue. When somebody gives you a piece of feedback that you don't agree with, or the conversation goes in a way that just isn't productive anymore, and maybe you're feeling your blood pressure rise, I would say the best thing to do isn't fight with them. It isn't seek validation from them and get them to tell you how smart they are. Just say thank you. maybe take a note and then walk away.
That's what the notebook's for.
Yeah. But also, I mean, it's there to actually take notes, but it also is a way
You're
to
writing it
communicate to
down.
people.
Writing it
Mike
down.
has another bad idea.
Have
I'm
I-
writing this down so Mike thinks I'm listening to his bad idea.
I mean, I've literally done that kind of thing in a playtest before where it's just like, I am doing this to keep myself engaged. This playtest is off the rails. And sometimes you can call off a playtest when it's on the rails. But like, I don't know. We talked about this episodes ago, and you now say it at the end of the episode. Like, part of the reason that I say thank you for the gift of Cube, besides the fact that it's nice, besides the fact that it's hokey and it's weirdly formal, it punctuates an experience. Sometimes it's a way to just say, like, this is all the feedback that I have for you. Or, thank you so much for playing this. This feedback has become painful for both of us, but I don't know if we're going to stop unless we stop. So thank you.
I am not thanking Mike when he gives me the feedback that oxidize is not what burned bread is. So mad at him last night. What a jerk.
Language is hard, man.
Yeah, the game is about using language in creative ways. Anyway.
The game is about facilitating human communication. And in
Mike,
this
you're
case-
on notice for failing middle school chemistry.
Mike's not going to hear this.
Mike's on notice. Mike does not listen to the podcast, which is for the better. On that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. And for now, the end of the Barash files.
We got through a lot.
I think we will have future Barash files, if not in the near future. You know, you got a baby on the way, but, you know, at some point, you're going to want a little break. And you can come on down and we can do more Barash files episodes.
That'd be lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to have these two. You'll know if you're listening to this how well my winter and spring of 2025 have gone. The later you're listening to this, the more I was able to just keep these banked and not have to use them up early. If you're listening to this in like January, I really messed up. So, fingers crossed. Anyway, if we got any of the card text wrong in this episode, that was entirely intentional to get you to leave a comment, which is going to boost this episode in social media. So don't you fall for that little dirty trick of ours. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about magic cards and speaking into microphones about it. Anthony and Zach, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you, Zach, for giving us so much of your time and sharing so much.
You gave so much of yourself this week.
Great insight into Cube for for our listeners, yes, but also I just really value everything that you've given us. And Andy, thank you for organizing this and doing all of the actual hard work and editing it.
Yeah. And thank you both for being great friends, building a great community, being enjoyable to talk to, and for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of conversation.
And thank
Some
you
of which we're here for, and some of which you just listen to us have.
And thank you to Sadie for unplugging the laptop when she knew the episode ended.
Sadie says it's 20 minutes to dinner time. This laptop must be unplugged.